Good morning, everybody. I'm Salvallo, and I have been to every single country in the world. And this week, I'm telling you stories from the world's poorest countries, taking you inside what it's like in these countries, what it's like to visit these countries, and giving you a little bit more of what their wealth looks like, where it comes from, and why they are some of the poorest countries in the world. Today, I am going to be talking about the poorest countries in Oceania, in the Pacific Islands. So I'm excited to talk to you about a few of those and give you a better sense of the countries there. So the poorest country in Oceania is Kiribati. Now, the way that we look at the poorest countries in the world is GDP PPP per capita, which means the gross domestic product, purchasing power parity per person. Essentially what that looks at is how much money is produced by the country or in the country every year, and then how much is that money able to buy based on like a standard basket of goods, including like food and housing and such, and then dividing that by the number of people. In doing that, we find that Kiribati has a GDP PPP per capita of only around $2,000. Now, if you look at the global average, which is a little bit above $17,000, that means that the average person in the Kiribati has 8 times less money every year than the average person globally. And then if you look at some of the world's like most developed countries, which have averages closer to about 60,000 or 70,000, then the average person in the Kiribati has 30 or more times less money every year than the average person in developed countries of Europe and the Gulf and North America. So it's quite a severe situation in terms of like the ranking. Kiribati is one of like the 25 poorest countries in the world as well. Why is Kiribati so poor? The problem with Kiribati is that it's incredibly spread out. It's 5,000 kilometers. It's almost as long as the entire United States, but it's lots of small little islands. So there's not much land. It's, hours and hours of flights between all of the different islands. It's not near any major market. So though it's kind of close to Australia, like but halfway between China and the States, there's not a big market that it can kind of benefit from being near to. The other thing that's interesting about Kiribati is the way that Kiribati does make money is actually mostly from things that happen internationally that don't really affect the day-to-day life of people in terms of it doesn't provide employment. So the main ways that Kiribati makes money is on 3 things. One is on fishing licensing. So because it has such a large area, most of which is sea, they give licenses to international fishing vessels to fish in the Kiribati waters. So they get a lot of money from that. They also get a lot of development aid. That's really interesting for the Pacific Island countries because they get a lot from Australia, which is near to them, also from the Asian Development Bank. But a lot of these countries, including Kiribati, get a lot of money from Taiwan because Taiwan, which is in the kind of intractable conflict with mainland China and is trying to get recognition in international community, they give a lot of money to these small countries that have a UN vote, that have a presence in that international community to try and persuade it to to have that presence or that recognition of Taiwan as well. And so it's like interesting geopolitics that get played out in the Pacific. The third way that Kiribati makes its money is on remittances. So a lot of Kiribati people, they go abroad to sometimes to the States, to Australia, to New Zealand, all around the world, and they send money back home. So obviously the fishing, international companies fishing, aid money just coming in and remittances coming in doesn't give people like employment. And so a lot of the Kiribati people, they rely kind of on subsistence activities such as fishing themselves or like small kinds of farming. Kiribati is also, though it's incredibly like widely spread and there's lots of little islands, on the main island of Tarawa, there is, and in the downtown part of the atoll, there is one of the world's most densely populated places, like similar to the Gaza Strip, similar to like some cities in Southeast Asia. So the amount of people that are living in this tiny amount of space is almost unbelievable. You can see a cat's tail behind me. Another reason why Kiribati has like a tough economic situation, not necessarily now, but increasingly for the future, is climate change. So in the Pacific, you have kind of two types of like islands. You have like mountain peaks that are essentially like an underwater mountain, and the peak comes out of the water above sea level. And so they're like mountainous, and that's kind of like in parts of Micronesia. And then you have atolls, which are the rim of a volcano. So they end up being kind of like circular shaped islands. So with all of this in mind, what is it like to visit Kiribati? I went to Kiribati in 2016 around Christmas time, and I stayed for 4 days or 5 days. I know that I stayed an extra day because my flight got canceled. That happens a lot in the Pacific. The flight schedules just like randomly change. So I was at the airport ready to go, and suddenly they said, oh, actually it's gonna come tomorrow instead. So I think I was there for 5 days. I had a really, really good time because it was around Christmas, and so there was a lot of festivities, there's a lot of parties. The little guest house that I stayed at had their employees party for the year, and so they invited me to that. And I remember that we had this little party out on the beach, and I walked out there and they were doing like some traditional singing, all of the women, and then there was this table just full of food, and it all came from coconut. And I didn't even know you could do all of these things with coconut, but it was like baked coconut and fried coconut and coconut milk curries, but then also like from the coconut meat shredded, and like sweet and savory. And I was just like blown away by all that they can do, like kind of all the innovations and all of kind of like the creative ways that they work with. The other thing that people do actually related to Christmas is that there is a Christmas island in Kiribati. It's a smaller island. It's not like a main population center of the country, but a lot of people like to travel there, especially for Christmas. A lot more tourists go there for Christmas than any other time of the year, obviously because it's called Christmas Island. They also, because of where they're positioned on the international date line, so within the time zone, they're one of the first places that rings in the new year. So a lot of people will go for New Year's Eve to the outer islands that are more eastern, and they will be the first people in the world to celebrate the new year. People also like to go to Kiribati to look at some World War II sites because there was a lot of action in the Pacific theater that took place in Kiribati. There's still some fortifications left on the beach, some like shells of the different like war constructions there. So there's a few little like remnants of that, and they're not positioned in like museums or anything. It's really just like on a random beach there'll be a big steel, or there'll be like a huge rusting piece of metal that like at one time was a gun fortification. So that's kind of interesting to go around and see. My favorite thing always about the Pacific is the sunsets and the sunrises. I would always make sure that every single day I would wake up in time for sunrise and stay up until sunset, and I would look just out at the like flat Pacific Ocean expanse and just see these beautiful God-given colors. And that always is what I think about when I first think about the Pacific and first think about Kiribati, is the incredibly beautiful sunsets that all you can say is like, glory be to God. Like to me, that's the most like beautiful thing in the world. And I was really lucky when I was in Kiribati that I saw a lot of just like phenomenal sunsets and sunrises while I was there. So in Kiribati, on the main island of Tarawa, the highest point at all anywhere is only 3 meters above sea level, which means that's going to be one of the first countries that will like sink as sea levels rise. And so that's causing like a lot of worry, and luckily there's a lot of action that's being taken like between the Pacific Islands to kind of like make this more known that they are struggling with this, and this is going to be something that they're going to have to think about a lot in the future. The other thing I would say about traveling to these countries is that there's very different experiences if you go into the outer islands. Specifically in Kiribati, I didn't get a chance to go to any of the outer islands, but life on the outer islands is often completely different to life in the capital. Often they don't have electricity, they have like more problems with water. They live more in the type of ways that they did like more in the past. There's a lot less, and that's the same in any of these countries that we talk about. Often the capital has a higher level of wealth than the rural areas or the places further outside, but this is definitely true in the Pacific, where you have completely varied lifestyles based on where they're located. I'll talk about two of the other countries in Oceania that are some of the poorest in the world. Those are Solomon Islands and Vanuatu. Both of these countries also have GDP, PPP per capita around 2,000, Vanuatu a little bit closer to 3,000. So again, comparing that to the international average of 17,000 and the kind of developing country range of like 60 to 70,000. These two countries are a little bit different from Kiribati in that they have a larger population. Solomon Islands is almost like 500,000 people. So there's a little bit more economic possibility just by having like a larger workforce, but they still struggle a lot. Interesting with the Pacific is that though there's only like 14 countries in the Pacific, they're spread out over an insanely large part of the world, and so the cultures are like very different, even though a lot of people think all the islands are similar. So Vanuatu and Solomon Islands are both like Melanesian, so they're closer to Asia, whereas Kiribati is more popularly would be thought of with like more Hawaiian, Polynesian, like Moana kind of vibes. Melanesia, where Vanuatu and Solomon Islands are, is closer to like Indonesian and Malay, or kind of in between the two. But the very different cultures, very different types of places. Vanuatu, I went in 2015 when Vanuatu was my 100th country. So I like celebrated there. I was like on the radio. I like had a little like small party at the time. I went in 2015 in the summer. I was living in New Zealand, working there, and so I went for a long weekend for like 2 nights and 3 days. I stayed in this really cool little hotel that was on its own. It was like a hostel, like it wasn't like a resort or anything. It had its own island, so 360 views of water, like in this little lake. It had this underwater post office that it was famous for, so I enjoyed that. I also liked when I was there, I went on this really, really long hike up these mountains and got really nice views all out into the landscape. But in Vanuatu, there's a lot of like active volcanoes, and they're also famous for this kind of like traditional bungee jumping thing. There's a lot of things to do on the outer islands, like if you had like 2 weeks to go to Vanuatu. Obviously when I was working full-time, going for a weekend, I didn't have that time. Solomon Islands, I went on the same trip that I went to Kiribati in 2016, and around like in December. And 3 things I remember most about Solomon Islands. Just like every Pacific Island country, the sunsets are insane. But there's this one, I was walking around like the downtown, because Honiara, I think is how you say it, the capital city, is somewhat large. I mean, there's like 100,000 or more people that live there. But there was like, I was walking across this bridge, and there's this insane sunset, and it's one of my favorite photos I've ever taken. I actually just like stood there for like an hour just taking so many photos and like playing with different colors and like watching it change. And I'll always remember that. The second thing is that I always love to try and get like a bird's eye view. I don't drone, but I also just like kind of the idea of climbing. So I like went into some like building downtown and just like went up the stairs like very suspiciously and kind of like creepily. But I got to the top, and I got some like nice views, like to kind of get a better understanding of the city. What's interesting in Solomon Islands, like I said, where a lot of the other Pacific Islands are very small populations, what's interesting in Solomon Islands, unlike a lot of the other places that are quite small, even in the capitals, and so they kind of feel more like village life. In Solomon Islands, it is really a city, so there is a lot of people, a lot of activity, a lot happening. So it's a totally different vibe than the other Pacific Island countries. So it was nice to spend time like walking down around downtown and kind of like getting that sense in Solomon Islands. And the third thing that I remember in Solomon Islands is this horrible memory of I was leaving at like 3 a.m. on a flight on my last day, and so I decided to just go to a like a cheap hotel, and I had bought these like snacks, and I had like left them open like in the night. I'd eaten some in the night, I was gonna eat some in the morning. So when I woke up, I got dressed and I was completely ready, and I like grabbed the bag and I'm gonna like pour it out onto my hand. And as I do that, a mouse jumps onto my hand and then jumps onto the floor, and I was just like so grossed out and so shocked. And the taxi driver of the hotel was going to like knock on my door, let's say at like 3, and this happened at like 2:59. And so the guy like knocks on the door and I open it, I'm just like staring at my hand like in disgust. And I wash it like 1,000 times, but I remember like being at the airport and just being like, I felt like violated in the most like it was just horrible. So that was my like final memory in Solomon Islands. But anyway, so that's a little bit more about some of the poorest countries in Oceania, in the Pacific. I hope that you enjoyed learning more about my experiences there, a little bit more about the way that the economy is set up, the way it works, doesn't work. So comment down below any questions. Please like the video, subscribe if you haven't already. And also there's going to be videos like this for every continent, so I hope that you will enjoy them as well. I hope that everybody will travel safe.